Hi guys, Mac here again. I've just finished recovering one of my friend's laptops. Unfortunately, she was hit with some ransomware and it's encrypted all of her data and her backup drives as well. Now fortunately, I had a copy of her data from a few months ago when I set up her new laptop for her. So we've managed to get most of the data back, although there are some missing bits, obviously. Now, personally, I'm sure I go vastly over the top with my backups, and I also include some stuff specifically to counter ransomware. So I thought it might be interesting today to have a discussion about how I do that. And also I'd like to hear how other people deal with it as well, because I'm sure, like I say, I probably go over the top. And the reason for that is because several years ago now, I managed to lose quite a few photos that were quite valuable to me, and it was through my own stupidity rather than anything else. And ever since then, I've overprotected. But anyway, let's go and have a look at this. And in particular, let's have a look at how I protect against ransomware. Now, what I'm talking about here is not necessarily how to protect on the desktop with things like antivirus and, not downloading hooky software and all that sort of good stuff. It's more around how do I protect it from a backup scenario. And like I say, I'd love to hear how you guys deal with it as well, because I'm sure I go over the top. Anyway, let's get into this and I'll show you what I do. To start off then, let's have a look at how I protect against ransomware. Now, just to be clear, this is specifically a mechanism to protect against ransomware. It's not my normal backup routine, and I'm open for discussion on it because I suspect the way I'm doing it is a little bit inefficient and there might be better ways of doing this. I'm all ears. So let's have a look at the scenario. I've got my server here that's got all of my files on. Now, much like a lot of people, I also use some online cloud storage. For the purposes of this explanation, it doesn't really matter if it's Dropbox or OneDrive. I predominantly use OneDrive, but I also have Dropbox for my own personal stuff. So imagine the scenario, I've got my files on my file server on the left there, and they're automatically replicated up to OneDrive and Dropbox. That doesn't give us any protection against ransomware. In this scenario, if all my files got encrypted and locked on my machine, those files would also be replicated up to OneDrive or to the cloud storage. Now, those cloud storage platforms, they do have file history and things like that. And I suppose that's one way to address this issue, but it makes me a little bit nervous and I'm not sure that's the right strategy for it. So I have a slightly different strategy. So what I do every Friday is I zip up my main data sets and I put them in a monthly folder. So as you can see here, I have a folder for every month, and then every Friday I zip up my main data sets and pop them into those folders. Now, like I said a few minutes ago, this still doesn't protect against ransomware because we still have that replication coming from that on-premises machine. So if that was to get locked, that data would get replicated up to my storage, and I'm not sure I'd want to rely on things like file history and things like that. So how do I counter this? Well, the way I counter this is by having a file storage in my online storage area that has no connection back to my on-premises equipment. So what I do is every time I do a backup and drop it into my monthly setup just there, I also, within the cloud service itself, I copy it across to separate monthly folders in a non-synchronized backup set. So that non-synchronized set, it has no connection to that on-premises machine. So let's say, for example, my on-prem machine was to get compromised, and let's say for the sake of this demonstration that I don't notice this has happened, and what happens is all those files in their locked and encrypted state get copied up to my cloud storage. Now what I will see is that I've lost my local files and I've also lost my cloud storage. In this scenario though, because there is no relationship between my on-premises machine and my cloud storage only copy of my files just there, I'm protected. I now have a way to go and get those files. Now obviously I have to be careful when I do this, just to make sure that I don't try and connect it up directly by syncing it to a machine, so I could potentially expose my non-sync backups to my desktop machine. But that's how I do it. The reason I set this up was during that period where all the NHS sites got hit by the ransomware attack. So I needed something quick and easy to make sure that I wasn't exposed to such stuff, because I do a fair bit of work with the NHS. And this method, it's become quite easy. It's something I've got so used to doing. It takes me 15 minutes every Friday morning, and it gives me that level of protection. I would be interested to hear how other people handle this though, and I'm very much open to ideas. So come back to me and let me know what you think. So let's have a look and see how I deal with my normal day-to-day backups. Now I have a 2018 Mac Mini at the heart of my passive services. By passive services, I mean things like my central file store. It runs things like Plex. There's got a couple of virtual machines on there, things like that. Stuff that I don't really care about the performance of, and I just leave it in the corner and it just runs forever. So let's have a look and see how I do my on-premises backup. So I have my server backup with macOS Time Machine. Now Time Machine is very, very simple to set up. It just runs a backup every hour, does a differential type backup. Now I know you can do this on Windows, but one of the things I find really interesting is that pretty much everyone that I know who has a Mac uses Time Machine to back their machines up. I don't find that my friends that use Windows predominantly, for example, use the automated tools to back up their machines. That's quite interesting, that, isn't it? I mean, perhaps it's down to how accessible the Time Machine element is. I'm not really sure why there's such a big differential in take-up of that sort of service. Now, what you'll see here is that the first backup will run on NAS Unit 1, which is a Synology. The second unit will run to NAS Unit 2. Now, NAS Unit 2 is not actually based at the same site as NAS Unit 1. That's why I have two backups going. Now, in addition to those Time Machine backups, I also replicate those two Synology units because there is some relatively static data that I wouldn't want repeated constantly within my Time Machine backup. So I actually replicate those two NAS, and that's things like my media collection and also, static data that doesn't tend to change very often. Now, beyond this, I then add in this service. And what this service is an online backup service, something like CrashPlan or Backblaze. There's various products out there, but essentially my server is constantly copying all of my files or any change files up to that backup service. Now, that backup service as well also has things like file history. But as I talked about earlier, I didn't really want to rely on that sort of stuff for protection against ransomware type stuff. So that's how I have my backup scenario set up. I think it's fairly extensive, and I think it has most scenarios covered. I should always have copies of my data, and the thing that's interesting about it is that the only reason I go to such lengths is because I have felt the pain of losing data before, and in my case it came down to things like photos and a couple of videos, which are really hard to replicate, obviously. Anyway, I'd be really interested to hear other people's opinion on how they do the backups. I know it's a very dry subject, but I'm interested in how you go about protecting from ransomware beyond the common sense things that you do on your desktop, like, antivirus and all that sort of good stuff. So it's quite hard to make this subject sound interesting because, let's face it, it's not an interesting subject to cover. Now, one thing I didn't cover in the video was how much data we're actually talking about. So in total in that cloud service, I've got about 5 terabytes of information, and that's everything from file documents to videos and also my photo collections and all that sort of good stuff. In terms of actual how much data I generate, well, every Friday my backup set is about 5 gigabytes, so it's not massive, and there was a lot of duplication in that backup as well because I don't do differentials every Friday. I'm also very lucky because I have quite an amazing internet connection. It's a gig up and down, so of course it makes working with either remote NAS service or remote cloud services a lot easier, but I am convinced that I'm doing way too much and I can probably simplify it. And it's that simplification that I'm interested in hearing from other people about. So stick your thoughts in the comments or drop me an email. I'll be really interested to hear how you deal with such things.